right, great. Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time to chat with me. There are a lot of very obvious shared struggles between Hawaiʻi and Boriken, and I'm seeing a lot of connection happening right now on Twitter. So I feel like this is the perfect time to do an interview with both of you. Grateful again to connect, and I'm sure many, many Boricuas are going to be looking forward to this interview, this episode. First, I'm going to let you guys tell listeners about yourself. Ehulani, why don't you get started?
Can do. Aloha mai kako o wau o ka ihilani ihu pane la skonya. No wai manalo ame kane o he mai au a ka kenoha nei au I ka ahupa o manoa. So aloha everybody. My name is Kaihilani Ihupani Lasquanya, but I go by Ihilani or Ihi. I'm from Waimanalo and Kaneohe, which is on the east side of the island of Oahu. Right now I live in Manoa, which is more so the town side. A little bit about me, my educational background. So I'm currently a senior at the University of Hawaii at Manoa studying ethnic studies, but I'm also a minor in political science as well as receiving a certificate in women's studies. And through the Department of Ethnic Studies, I'm also a first-year master's student in education with a focus in education administration in higher education. Besides that, I've done some student organizing with this organization called Ke'ike Kahokani, which is for the protection of Mauna Kea. So if listeners don't know, the University of Hawaii, along with the illegal like fake state of Hawaii, wants to construct the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea, which is the biggest Mauna or mountain in all of Hawaii. It's also one of the most sacred spaces in Hawaii. So working to stop that, and in relation to that, fight for the deoccupation and decolonization of Hawaii. But yeah, super excited to talk story with you folks and learn more about all of us. So mahalo.
Great, thank you. All right, Mikey, you take it away.
Hi, I'm Mikey Ozoa Aglagoob. I am a Filipina, Boricua, anti-imperialist feminist organizer in the illegally occupied Kingdom of Hawaii. I'm a founding member of Affirm Hawaii. So we're the local chapter of a transnational feminist organization, and we actually have 10 chapters and growing rapidly across the US and in Hawaii. And actually we have a chapter in Boriken, which was inspired by the when Ihi and some of our Kanaka sisters were on Mauna Kea on the front lines protecting the Mauna from desecration, was the same time that Boriken was rising up. I think it was the
Ricky Renuncia, yes.
Rosselló.
Yes,
Yeah,
governor.
yeah, it was literally the same time. And
Wow.
I think that there are also demonstrations happening in Guahan. And so we were just like, oh my God, 1898, like all, it was incredible. It was an incredible time. So yeah, the Boriken chapter of Affirm was born out of that. Affirm Hawaii was really highlighting like all the different connections between all of our struggles for centuries, right? So, but back to me, I am also an expert in gender violence, advocacy, and training. And I hold a law degree from the UH Manoa William S. Richardson School of Law. And I also did my undergraduate degree at UH Manoa. And I have what is my degree in? In women's studies and Spanish. But yeah, I'm so excited. I love, like, I wore my 1898 ring for this. I had to. I live this.
Oh, I love that. I really love that. When you told me you had that, I was like, everyone needs to get one of those.
Yes.
We all need
Everyone's
to like yes, it makes a difference, like to be able to connect with you guys and understand that we are not alone in the struggle and that we can continue to build together. So I guess I'll start with the first question I had, because I feel like, what is the first thing that comes to mind for both of you? I know that's a simple question, but when you think about Hawaii and Boriken, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
So he's thinking, I'll answer. So my grandma actually is the first thing that comes to mind. Her mom was trafficked from Boriken at the age of 13 as a quote unquote mail order bride, which of course is a euphemism for girls and women trafficked for marriage. She was trafficked here to Hawaii, married a Portuguese plantation laborer, and then she later remarried like 3 or 4 times. And then her third husband, I believe, was my grandma's father. So yeah, really, really, really interesting history.
For me, besides the fact that I think we both have like super good food that's like top tier,
Very important.
very important. Like, once like this pandemic is over, and we have like a Hawaii and Boriken like episode where
Yes,
we're gonna cook together, like
absolutely.
gonna go down and it's gonna be so good. But
I'm so there.
yeah, but another thing that comes to mind besides like the super good food, is shared struggle, of American occupation. And I think we can probably get to that in like questions to come. But really just learning about how our struggles are so interconnected and how, um, none of us will be liberated unless all of us are, and just really trying to think and strategize how we can take down, American imperialism and imperialism in general, so that, you know, we can live a better life for this generation and the next 7. Yeah.
Yes. Oh my God. Wow. It's funny. I was gonna get some tissues because I'm like, I'm gonna cry. I know I'm gonna cry. I feel like this is so, this is a struggle that I feel like even for Boricua specifically in the diaspora who are not able to live in Boriken and have been displaced, like I feel like a lot of us don't even learn the history. So I kind of want to start maybe there, like you said, like the history of Hawaii is whitewashed, it is warped, it is twisted into a narrative that fits, white comfort. So I guess I want to start, give us some context if you can, for anyone listening, like how did Hawaii become a state, or anywhere you wish to start, honestly?
Perfect. I think that's a super good question to start with. And before I get into like my little like crash course spiel, I also want to highlight that it's no mistake that we don't know our histories and that we don't know the histories of others. So even growing up in Hawaii, so much of what I uncovered and learned about the true history, the true history of political history of Hawaii, I should say, it's still kind of hidden. And unless you know where to look, or if you're in those communities, um, yeah, American imperialism and colonialism still heavily exist in education in Hawaii, America. So a lot of us still don't know about our political history, and then a lot of us still don't know the political history, of other occupied people. So I feel like this is a really good place to start. Um, so going back to my spiel, Hawaii was a constitutional monarchy. So we had different treaties, we had different constitutions throughout the years. As early as 1839, we had a Declaration of Rights through this constitutional monarchy, with our first official constitution happening in 1840. On July 31st, 1843, we had this really historical holiday, and we still celebrate it, called La Ho'i Ho'i'ea. So uh, Lord, he's not really a Lord, he sucks. George Paulet, of the British like crown, declared Hawaii for Britain. And then so sovereignty was ceded under protest. And then Sir Admiral Richard Thomas, who was also British, came. He saw what was happening, and then he quote unquote restored sovereignty to Hawaii. And then in November 28th of that same year, 1843, we had the Anglo-Franco Proclamation signed. So that was Great Britain, not that great, and France acknowledging that Hawaii was independent. And then, unfortunately, in 1875, we had this treaty called the Reciprocity Treaty, and it's kind of similar to what happened in Puerto Rico with sugar. So because sugar was like not an incredible, like a huge export in Hawaii, and largely white, actually all white oligarchs wanted no tax because they wanted like to make themselves rich. It was signed so that Hawaii could just export their sugar to America, even though it wasn't officially a part of America. So the way that that demolished and devastated Hawaiian lands and Hawaiian bodies was just absolutely horrible. July 1st, 1887, we had the Bayonet Constitution. So King Kalakaua, which is one of our last reigning monarchs, essentially by gunpoint or bayonet point, needed to sign this new constitution that would essentially relinquish all of his powers and allow white oligarchs to control the constitutional monarchy. And then fast forward to July 1st, 1887, there was the bayonet. Oh, sorry, I talked about that already. January 17th, 1893, when Queen Liliuokalani, our last reigning monarch, right after Kalakaua, was illegally overthrown and then later imprisoned. And then from then on until and then 1894, we became Republic of Hawaii, which was ruled by those same oligarchs. And then in 1897, Hawaii was annexed to the United States. But what's actually really interesting over here is that we were annexed via joint resolution. So if you're not extremely familiar with American politics, even according to American law, which Americans constantly break their own law, joint resolutions can only be passed between existing states within like the United States. So for example, there could be an annexation between like, or a treaty between, or a joint resolution, I should say, between California and Washington, California, Oregon. But because Hawaii was not actually incorporated within the United States, like that's already fraud. And also when people talk about the treaty of annexation, there was no treaty. There was no paper document. This was just something that was passed in the Senate in America between Americans. And so that's my spiel, actually, going back and reversing. In 1959, there was a referendum where a large majority of people of Hawaii, and the majority was not Kanaka Maoli or Native Hawaiians, voted to become a state. And we've been a state since August 21st, 1959.
And actually, just to add on to that, the referendum itself was fraudulent because there's supposed to, per like, is it the United Nations? There's supposed to be an option to, so you can vote to become a state, you can vote to remain a territory, and then there's supposed to be an option to return to sovereignty, but that option wasn't on there. So like every step of the way was either US facilitated or backed, or it was the US's actual actions. But every step of the way was fraudulent. So yeah.
And it sounds like, I guess this is just a follow-up question. It sounds like you said, history has sort of been warped, or like people don't know it. Where can people find like real history, or to me it sounds like community and like organizing has led to more understanding. Is that sort of what's happened over there as well? Because that's sort of what I've seen in Boriken, so I'm kind of curious how it's sort of come to light.
Yeah, I agree. And I think political consciousness has been on the rise, and I really do want to credit in like the late 1970s, there was a Hawaiian Renaissance where people began to uncover these documents. So something that's really interesting, and if your listeners wanted to check this out, they can Google Ku'e petitions, and that's K-U-E. There's not the diacritical marks, but just to help your listeners. And although, like I talked about in my previous answer, there was a lot of hurtful and messed up things via American law and policy that caused so much harm to Hawaii. Like in Boriken, there's always been a history of resistance. There's always been people being loud and vocal and saying that they do not consent. So in the Ku'e petitions, you can see that like over 90% of Hawaiians opposed like this fake and illegal annexation. And so it was really in the Hawaiian Renaissance in the 1970s where this political consciousness awakened. And then more people began to learn Olala Hawaii, because Olala Hawaii was banned until the 1970s. And so, yeah, colonization and education is so real, especially in Hawaii. But I really, I guess, in more contemporary times, not even like the 70s was that long ago, but the movement to protect Mauna Kea really created this huge wave of political consciousness for Hawaii, where a lot of Hawaiians and settler allies are really trying to think about what it means to be here and what it means to create a future where we can all exist. And a lot of that has come with relearning our history, because we think we know because we were taught like an American standard of education and what happened to Hawaii. But really, it's a lot of relearning and unlearning to do. But yeah, Ku'e petitions would be a good segue into that.
Okay.
And then towards like the end of our conversation, I can even put it in the chat too, but I can also link a bunch of different really good Kanaka-led organizations that do a lot of great work to spread this kind of consciousness.
I would love that. Yeah, because I think it would take hours for us to go into all of the things. And I know that there's definitely a lot of Boricuas who want to do the work and learn and try to figure out how like we can be allies and help each other. And I think a part of that, you know, you touched on that too, like the migration of Boricuas to Hawaii. So if we want to maybe, you know, either of you could answer or both of you, but talk a little bit about how Boricuas were displaced and maybe what the dynamic was, and especially like you said, as like the struggle, people started to like realize things, like how that kind of came to be.
Oh, I can chime in a little bit. Mahalo to the Department of Ethnic Studies for teaching me this. But thinking about when the first people from Boriken came to Hawaii, it was largely because of the plantation industry and plantation era. So unfortunately, like, as you know, I think it was the year 1899 where there was two huge hurricanes that hit Boriken, and because of that, I like that you bring up the fact that a lot of Boricuas were displaced, and I think it inspires us or challenges us to think about how different people end up in different like situations. And I'll answer the question in a little bit, but I really like that you talked about that, because in Hawaii, a huge conversation that we're now beginning to have and reconcile with is this idea of settler colonialism and what it means to be a good settler in Hawaii. And so there's a huge difference between someone who's a settler in Hawaii because they descended from missionaries and oligarchs who caused a lot of harm. And then there's also people who are settlers in Hawaii because of natural disasters, or largely American imperialism completely devastated their homelands, which is why they ended up here. So thank you so much for wording that in such a beautiful way, because it really allows us to acknowledge our shared histories of imperialism, but also like climate crisis and disaster and what's going to happen in the future. But going back, the first noted, like officially documented Boruca people came to Hawaii. They landed in 1901, but their journey started in 1900. And they went to Lahaina, which used to be the capital of the Kingdom of Hawaii, but there was a sugar plantation there, and they began to work there. And I believe it was either 55 or 57 men who first came. And then throughout the time of like the plantation era, I think about it was about 5,000 men, women, and children from Boriken came to Hawaii, worked on all different plantations from different islands. So there were plantations like on Kauai, Oahu, Maui, Hawaii Island, Lanai, but that was more so pineapple. But I guess it would be important to talk about the timeline. So in the context of Boricua folks coming to Hawaii to work at the plantations, which was in 1900, 1901, if we're being more specific, the sugar industry and the plantation industry in general really started to boom and kick off in the 1850s. So by that time, there was already an ethnic population of largely of East Asian folks, because plantation owners largely not necessarily advocated for, but recruited a lot of Chinese folks, a lot of Japanese folks, some Okinawan folks, some Filipino folks, and that was like 50 years prior to the first Puerto Rico folks coming to Hawaii. So I know in part of your question you talked about maybe like what were ethnic relations like there, and racism was really alive and well in Hawaii, and like plantation oligarchs made sure like that there was a racial hierarchy. So people like white folks and then Japanese folks and East Asian folks were sort of higher on that ladder of that racial hierarchy. It was really like how close you were to whiteness, and Portuguese folks as well, because they weren't the owners of the plantations, but they ran it. But then Hawaiians, Filipinos, Okinawans, and then Boricuas, we were kind of all in the same mix because we were like on the bottom of that social hierarchy. So to my knowledge, there was no known like ethnic conflict, although like things weren't perfect on the plantations, but it was more so we were both subject to the same harm of plantation life. And also like the population of Kanaka and Borikus was a lot smaller on the plantations compared to say like Chinese folks or Japanese folks, just like demographically. Yeah. Does that answer the question a little bit and just talk about perfect?
Yeah, absolutely. Mikey, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I was actually reading, and I'll include this in the, I know you asked for like reading recommendations, but there's this book called Islanders in the Empire. So it's all about Filipino and Boricua laborers in Hawaii working the plantations. And like Ihi said, like it wasn't until, yeah, like 50 years after the plantations had already been established that Filipinos and Boricuas came to work the plantations. And it was weird because, 1898, the US acquired both the Philippines and Boriken. And so they were, Boricuas and Filipinos were uh, in this weird, they were able to travel freely from Boriken and the Philippines to Hawaii because it was technically all under US jurisdiction. And so they didn't have the same immigration limitations, I guess, as other immigrant workers, but they also didn't have as many protections. So there weren't like embassies or whatever locally where they could go with to file like if they had any kind of grievance, work grievances. So if they had any kind of complaints, it would have to be routed all the way to DC. So of course, those grievances would take like at least a year to be addressed. And so it's interesting, like in one ways, or in some ways, they're not almost, I guess you could say, better off. And then in other ways, they're like extremely harmed by the fact that we were already technically part of the US by the time that all of these migrant laborers came over. So yeah. And then, oh, I was also reading, it's so interesting because so it was almost like they were traveling from colony to colony, right? And but it was, and so their experience was so unique because for Boricuas going to the continental US, they're met with like tons of racism and and then Boricuas and Filipinos remaining in like Boriken or in the Philippines, there's like these super harmful assimilation programs and like pro-US economic policies and American style government structures. And then yeah, you in Hawaii, it's just so unique. And there's this the plantation labor almost like it tempers the racial animosity, and yet it just the way that the racial hierarchies play out is just so unique. And I think you can absolutely say it has a lasting impact today.
Yeah, very interesting too, because when you talk about assimilation as well, it's like everything is framed as like, but hey, you have US citizenship, and like, hey, being like, that somehow our situation, we should just be grateful for it and like not question it, because it's like, oh, but look at all the benefits you have. And it, anyway, we could talk about that. But one person that comes to mind is Lolita Lebron, because she went to the Capitol in 1954, and she stormed the Capitol. And that's obviously like really interesting in the context of the recent Capitol riot and the fact that they didn't bring it up at all. Lolita and 3 others stormed the Capitol. But I'm curious, any other historical figures that, we can't go through all of them, but anyone that you could think of, famous Boricuas or Hawaiians or anyone that you have a similar kind of like maybe iconic figures that you could share with people.
100% Haunani K. Trask. Ihi and I were talking right before this, and her book, From a Native Daughter, is, it was like I mean, we both had that on our list of reading recommendations for you, but 1000% Haunani K. Trask for me.
Absolutely. I think if there was one text that I think radicalized like a lot of wahine or like women like in Hawaii and even like Kanaka or like Native Hawaiians in the diaspora, it was like From a Native Daughter. And I think more than anything, it's a coming home story and it gives people something to fight for. Um, but yeah, absolutely read the works of Hanani K. Trask. She talks about this theory of double colonization where like Native men um, like inflict the same harms of our colonizers and how like that's like repeated like and internalized in our own cultures and communities. So reading that, she talks a lot about tourism and linking that to the destruction of native lands and native bodies, which is perfect. But if people wanted I guess like a overview of both historical and contemporary Native Hawaiian struggles for sovereignty, land, waters, and people, there's this incredible book called A Nation Rising. And then I can link it as well. And it's by Dr. Noilani Goodyear Kaupua, who's a professor of political science at UH Manoa. And what's so awesome is I think in Hawaii we have an incredible or incredible academic genealogies. So Kumu Nailani Goodyear Kaupua was mentored by and learned from Dr. Hanani K. Trask. And so like just to see how these works are all connected to each other and also how it's the work of women like in academics and family and community who are literally just pushing the Lahui or the Hawaiian nation forward. It's incredible. So yeah, Hanani K. Trask, Noilani Goodyear Kaupua would be like Mikey and I's two biggest recommendations. Yeah.
I love that. That and the double colonization, I am so excited to read about that for sure. There's so much we can learn. I want to switch a little bit to talking about how similar our struggles are in the sense that we are fighting similar things because of colonialism. And like I came across a post just the other day about land, and I think in Boriken we're facing that for sure, and a debt crisis and all these health disparities, right? So you could start wherever you feel, but I really want to get into a little bit of the sort of health disparities. You know, someone from Hawaii reached out to me and talked about homelessness and like the disproportionate numbers with homelessness, also prisons. Really just want to hear a little bit more about that and ask people to really look into those things.
I'll jump in while he's thinking more. But so in Affirm Hawaii, we're really pushing for, so land back, right, is really, really, I feel like it's reaching critical mass. But we call for land back, bodies back. And because in Affirm Hawaii, it's important to us that we study the creation, the introduction, and the institutionalization of, all of these imperialist and colonizer institutions, including patriarchy, in our native homelands, and especially so here in Hawaii, since history is a crucial context to where, how, and why we organize. So a lot of people have this idea that land was colonized and then women. Even Marxists like Engels, he theorized that women's oppression was a consequence of the formation of private property. But in many of our homelands, and I would actually venture to say maybe in all conquered, quote unquote, conquered or colonized spaces, that the colonization of women by introduction of patriarchy by the colonizer actually allowed for the colonization of land. This is true for Hawaii, and it's also true for Boriken. So we look at the sex trade as like the one place that like where all these colonizer institutions intersect. So racism, sexism, capitalism, and the sex trade was introduced in Boriken in the late 1400s, shortly after Spanish contact in 1493 and at the onset of Spanish settlement. And so we know that Christopher Columbus, he established what we now know to be sex trafficking in Hispaniola, aka Haiti and Dominican Republic, as early as 1490. He sexually enslaved children as young as 9 years old. There are some incredible Native feminists like Christine Stark, who they actually documented in a recent report. It was actually from January 2020 about Native women and the sex trade. But they said Christopher Columbus and his men raped, enslaved, maimed, and murdered the Taino people upon landing on their shores. This included selling the Taino women and girls for rape, what is now called sex trafficking. Columbus wrote in his journals, 100 castellanos are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm. And it is very general. And there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand. So I think it was 1508 that the first town was quote unquote founded and established as the site of Boriken's first mining and agricultural operations. I think it was called Capara at the time. And then after 1521, gold mining had slowed. And then we see the further institutionalization of foreign business with the settlement of, or the establishment of sugarcane and ginger plantations. So then in Hawaii, we have a similar history. It's a little bit, it's like 2 or 3 decades later, 2 or 3 centuries later, but it's a very, very similar history. And I have to attribute this research to my affirmed sister, Yvonne Mahelona and Noelani Arista. But in 1778, we have the first instance of Western contact with the arrival of Captain Cook. And then by 1793, we have written evidence of the existence of sex trafficking. So there's a 1793 entry by a ship captain or about a ship captain, Captain Baker. He's kidnapping 2 young Hawaiian girls to take on his like months-long voyage at sea. And by 1825, the problem with sex trafficking here in Hawaii had gotten so bad that Queen Kahumanu, she instituted a kapu, or like a prohibition on prostitution, in the interest of protecting these poor Hawaiian girls and women from being trafficked. And then simultaneously, we have the sugar industry institutionalized in the islands. From 1802, the first sugar mill, and then 1835, the first sugar plantation. And then this all kind of culminates in the Mahea. They call it the Great Mahea, but it wasn't great. It was horrible. But it was the massive move. It was like the first massive move towards land privatization. And I think that all, was it 1848, Ihi? And yeah. And then we have the US backed overthrow in 1893, and then the illegal annexation of Hawaii by the US in 1898. And yeah, so what the sex trade and the introduction of patriarchy does is it separates people from land, like you're no longer reliant upon the land for subsistence. But then it also divides women and men and women along gender lines, right? And it teaches that like women are able to be commodified, and our worth is in our sexual and our reproductive labor. And at Affirm, we define patriarchy very simply. It's men's domination over women and gender minorities, men's domination over nature, and then men's domination over other men. And so we see patriarchy as this like colonizer, divide and conquer tool that over time helps to facilitate the process of colonizing the land. Because if human beings can be commodified and sold and bought, like, so can land, right? So, yeah.
Wow, that is powerful. And it also makes me think of just even like the fetishization of women from Boriken, from Hawaii, and then just like
Totally.
thinking of just there is a whole history that has led us to this point. Wow, I'm processing. I'm processing.
Sorry, that
It
was
is
so
that's a
much.
lot. Yeah, so
But
important.
it, like, you even see it today, like the first really the first awareness that I had around outside of family around being Boricua was young boys in high school telling me like, oh yeah, I've seen Puerto Ricans in porn. And it's like that Boricuas and the sex trade, like it just goes hand in hand for so in so many people's minds. And it's I mean, I don't have to tell you it's wrong, but
Right.
it's enraging.
Oh, it is. It's horrific and enraging. Absolutely. Wow. Well, but it also definitely like motivates me to continue to make more of these connections with other women. And, in Boriken, obviously, or maybe not obviously, there are like 3, 4, 5 collectives of women, Taller Salud, and all these other collectives that do great work and talk about patriarchy and fight the patriarchy. And so I'm looking forward to those stronger connections. And I'm curious from your perspective, maybe you could start, Mikey, just like what would help us create stronger connections between us?
I mean, I definitely want Ihi to also answer this, but I think just starting with knowing these shared histories and these shared struggles. Um, my sister Cara, she was telling us about, so around 1898, the Philippines and Boriken had this really beautiful revolutionary connection, because at this we both knew that um, we were both fighting US imperialism at the time, and they would send love letters to each other like in newspapers and stuff, and like there would be headlines like in Boriken like "Que quieres Filipinas?" and like just these beautiful acts of solidarity that I think we could we can totally, like, we have this solid foundation of solidarity to stand on and grow from. And yeah, I think that's the perfect place to start.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with Mikey. We have to learn um, our histories and our shared histories because there's so much overlap. And I can't help but think that it was all too intentional that we don't know enough about each other. That's colonization working. And in the context like of Hawaii, when we think about the people who orchestrated the overthrow and like sat in like the Republic of Hawaii, not only like were they these like politicians, quote unquote, but a few of them, Sanford B. Dole and Charles Reed Bishop, they actually served as the head of the Department of Education, like while everything was taking place. So looking at how key like erasing people's histories and like histories like of other places was so pivotal to our colonization and our illegal occupation. But I think it's in that undoing and then that relearning is where we can find our strongest solidarity. And I think even beyond matching up like, oh, like this is how like America harmed you, or this is how like Spain harmed you, like how like they like America harmed us, or how like Spain harmed like the Philippines. It's like, who are we as a people, like beyond our shared struggle of colonization? Like, what songs do you sing? Like, what are your mothers like what's your favorite place like to swim, like. And I think for me, like, it's in those really intimate ways of like knowing each other and being able to not just see us as our struggles, but to see our liberation in each other's eyes. I think is something that's gonna make this pili, or this relationship a lot more strong, a lot stronger. But yeah, I'm stoked. And just knowing that wahine and mahu are like women and the LGBTQ plus folks, we're going to be leading the charge and we're going to be there, you know, because the way that as someone who identifies as queer, and through like colonization, with like the commodification of native lands, native bodies, women got written out of this history like once, this mo'okuʻauhau, this genealogy, this history. And then queer folks, we get written out of it twice. It sucks. Like, not only are we not acknowledged as women, but we're not acknowledged as queer. And so the ways that we reproduce, and in the words of Hanani Ketras, being slyly reproductive, it's our job to take up the mantle, to charge, and to write ourselves back into our own stories and our own histories. Like, I may have not grown up being able like to call like my grandmothers by name, but I know them now because I know my language. And because I know my language and I know who I am, I'm able to look at other people in a more genuine way. And I think that's what solidarity is mostly. And yeah, I'm just stoked to be.
Beautifully
That was
said.
so beautiful. Damn you, E.
Oh wow. I actually, along with what you were saying, I was thinking about someone I spoke to recently, who was born and raised in Boriken, and she told me something I'd never heard of before. She said she grew up learning an old Taino prayer, and that they would say, and she's like, "Didn't you learn that?" And I was like, "No, I didn't." And it's just like that sharing of knowledge and the sharing of like the beautiful things of who we are, and not just, like you said, the things that are obviously so horrific. So I'm really glad, we were talking about Twitter and how Hawaiians and Boricuas are talking there. I guess just to end this, is there anything else that you wish to share, or anything you wish to talk about before we close out? Because I know there's a lot. I know we could find so many different things, but if there's any last things, or anywhere that if Boricuas are interested in learning more about a firm, where could we find that information? Maybe we could start there.
Sure. We're prolific on Instagram and less so on Twitter lately, but we're on there. But a firm is AF3 IRM Hawaiʻi, and it stands for the Association of Feminist Fighting. Wait. Association of Filipinas, no, I'm sorry, we just changed it. So our roots were a Filipino organization, but now we are obviously multicultural, gender diverse, but Association of Feminists Fighting Fascism, Imperialism, Refeudalization, and Marginalization. It's a mouthful, so just affirm. AF3IRM.
Beautiful. Yes, thank you. Well, if there, yeah, Elani, did you want to mention anything else?
I'll say that's what the acronym is. I mean, I was always on board with the firm, but cool acronym. I see why it's just a firm now, but that's super cool. Last words to my lahui, to the Hawaiian Nation. I love you folks, and I hope I did justice by you folks by having this conversation, and I know that it will hopefully lead to more. And to my Boricua or like friends, like po aloha aina, I see you, I love you, and I can't wait to know your stories and your songs. And this is just the beginning, or if not, a continuation of our shared struggle. And I'm really excited to see how our genealogies collide, because it's gonna be so beautiful. And yeah, mahalo. Or if you wanted to link or follow me on like Twitter or Instagram, sometimes I tweet things. Sometimes I post pictures of my nieces. It's really cute and political stuff. It's Ina Lihi, which is just Ihilani backwards, and it's INALIHI. Yeah, can't wait to
He's
meet.
incredible. My partner and I are always just like singing her praises. She's brilliant, but so humble about it. Teach us your ways.
Yes. Well, Iilani, Mikey, thank you so, so much for taking the time. I cannot wait to share this, and I am looking forward to the next one. Like you said, this is not the last, this is only the beginning. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.